The failure of a single mechanical component can convert a weapon of war in an archaeological artifact in seconds. On October 1st, 1943, the oil system failed. Oil pressure collapsed. The engine quit without spectacle. No fireball, no breakup, only a sudden loss of thrust. The aircraft did not disintegrate in the air. It descended into a dense, inhospitable landscape that would hold it fast for the next quarter of a century. The machine was a Republic P47D Thunderbolt, identified by the serial number 42-8066. It was a heavy, high-altitude fighter designed for the escort role, but on this day it was operating low over the tangled terrain of Papua New Guinea. The aircraft was known as Carter's Lil Pill. To the pilot and crew, this was a humorous reference to a popular medicinal laxative of the era, known as Carter's Little Liver Pills. To the history of aviation archaeology, however, this airframe would become a study in survival against the elements. The location was the Waigani Swamp, roughly 18 miles northwest of Port Moresby. This environment is defined by its hostility to mechanical preservation. It is a shallow, stagnant basin filled with dense kunai grass and acidic water. When the oil pump failed, the pilot, Second Lieutenant Wallace M. Harding, was forced to trade altitude for a controlled arrival into this organic morass. The swamp does not negotiate with heavy machinery. It absorbs mass and hides it. For 25 years, the aircraft remained exactly where it stopped. This long duration of static rest is defined by the concept of in situ preservation. In a high-traffic zone or accessible farmland, a downed aircraft is typically salvaged immediately for scrap metal or stripped for parts by locals. But the Waigani Swamp created a protective perimeter of inaccessibility. The water level fluctuated with the seasons, alternately submerging the aluminum skin and exposing it to the humid tropical air. The dense vegetation grew over the wings and fuselage, hiding the geometric shape of the aircraft from casual observation. The mud in such an environment acts as a chemical seal. While the upper surfaces exposed to the air are vulnerable to rapid oxidation and biological overgrowth, the lower sections encased in the anaerobic sediment are often shielded from the free oxygen that drives the most aggressive forms of corrosion. This creates a dual state of decay. The canopy glass may craze and the steel fittings may rust, but the primary aluminum structure can survive if the alloy is high quality and the mud chemistry remains stable. Carter's Lil Pill sat in this suspension for 2.5 decades. The war ended. The vast armadas of aircraft that had operated over New Guinea were scrapped, melted down, and converted into consumer goods. Yet serial number 42-8066 remained intact, protected by the very terrain that had captured it. It became a time capsule, holding the technical configuration of late 1943 frozen in place. The identity of the airframe was never in question during the war. The loss was documented. Lieutenant Harding survived the event uninjured, extricating himself from the cockpit and beginning a trek back to safety. But the physical reality of the aircraft became a rumor, then a memory, and finally a ghost story among aviation historians. It was known to be there, but the logistical cost of entering the swamp to retrieve 5 tons of dead weight exceeded the value of the scrap metal. It was only when the historical value of the P-47 airframe surpassed the difficulty of the terrain that a recovery attempt became viable. The distinction was simple. This was not a crash. It was a forced landing into yielding vegetation, and that structural unity is what made recovery possible decades later. The transition from a powered aircraft to a ballistic projectile is governed by the laws of friction and fluid dynamics. For the pilot, Second Lieutenant Wallace M. Harding, the crisis began when the lubrication film inside his engine failed. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 is a radial engine containing 18 cylinders and thousands of moving parts, all capable of generating 2,000 horsepower. But this output is dependent on a continuous pressurized barrier of oil between the metal surfaces. When the oil pump failed, that barrier evaporated. The mechanics of an engine seizure are violent and irreversible. Without lubrication, the master rod bearings and cylinder walls experience immediate metal-on-metal contact. The friction generates a spike in temperature that exceeds the melting point of the alloy linings. Within seconds, the components weld themselves together. The massive propeller, which acts as a gyroscope and a thrust provider, grinds to a sudden halt. The silence that follows is not just the absence of noise, it is the absence of energy. At this moment, the aerodynamic nature of the P-47 Thunderbolt changed. This aircraft was designed as a high-speed energy fighter, weighing approximately 10,000 pounds. It was constructed to dive and zoom, not to float. With the engine seized, the Thunderbolt earned its nickname, the Flying Brick. It has a poor glide ratio, meaning it loses altitude rapidly for every foot of forward distance traveled. The drag of the large fuselage and the stationary propeller blades acts as an air brake. The pilot does not have the luxury of time to select a landing site. He is riding a descending elevator that is aiming for the ground. Lieutenant Harding faced a specific kinetic problem. He was too low to bail out safely, or perhaps he judged the terrain too hostile for a parachute landing. He had to put the aircraft down on the surface. The stall speed of a clean P-47 is roughly 109 miles per hour. Below this speed, the wings stop generating lift, and the aircraft falls out of the sky. He had to maintain enough speed to control the descent, but not so much that the impact would be fatal. The terrain of the Waigani Swamp presented a unique material constraint. If he lowered the landing gear, the wheels would catch in the mud and water. This would create a fulcrum at the bottom of the aircraft, flipping the 10,000-pound mass over onto its back, likely crushing the cockpit and drowning the pilot. The only viable option was a gear-up belly landing. This decision relied on the structural design of the Thunderbolt. The aircraft features a robust keel and heavy ducting for the turbo supercharger running along the bottom of the fuselage. In a gear-up landing, this structure acts as a skid plate. As Harding flared the aircraft just above the vegetation, the heavy steel engine block in the front acted as a plow. The impact dynamics in a swamp are distinct from a crash on hard soil or open water. The dense kunai grass and the layer of water over the mud acted as a progressive energy absorber. Instead of a hard stop that snaps the fuselage, the vegetation dragged against the metal skin, bleeding off the kinetic energy over a distance of several hundred feet. The deceleration was rapid but survivable. The aircraft did not cartwheel. It slid, slowed, and settled. Lieutenant Harding survived the sequence without injury. The cockpit integrity held. He climbed out of the aircraft, which was now resting in shallow water, upright and largely intact. However, his ordeal was not over. The swamp was a navigational trap. Harding had to trek through the difficult terrain for 2 days before he could locate Allied lines and report the loss. Behind him, the aircraft began its long period of stasis. The violence of the seizure and the slide had ended. The engine, fused into a solid block of useless metal, had served its final purpose as a protective shield for the pilot. The physics of the crash had placed the machine in a location where gravity and friction had done their work, and now the environment would take over. The swamp had caught the brick, and it would not let go easily. The recovery of an aircraft lost in a dense environment often depends on a small detail that bridges the gap between a rumor and a usable location. In the case of Carter's Lil Pill, one such detail did not come from a planned survey. It came from an error in procedure, a misstep in the operation of a camera system. In December 1943, the jungle and the swamp were already consuming the airframe. Vegetation grows rapidly in the tropical climate of Papua New Guinea, capable of obscuring a 40-foot wingspan in a matter of weeks. Without a visual anchor, the location of the crash, roughly 18 miles from Port Moresby, would have dissolved into the general monotony of the Waigani Swamp. The preservation of the location data fell to Lieutenant Klages of the 8th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron. His mission was to photograph specific enemy positions or terrain features, a task that required precise configuration of the camera equipment. Aerial photography in this era was a function of optics, film speed, and filtration. To cut through the atmospheric haze or to highlight specific vegetation patterns, the photographer had to select the correct glass filter for the lens. On this specific flight, Lieutenant Klages made a technical error. He had installed the wrong filter for his primary target run. In the discipline of aerial reconnaissance, this is a mission failure. The images would likely lack the contrast or definition required for intelligence analysis. Realizing the mistake, or perhaps needing to expend the remainder of the film roll to justify the sortie, Klages made a decision to divert. He banked his aircraft toward the known sector where Lieutenant Harding had put the Thunderbolt down months earlier. An aerial photograph is not merely a picture. With a known focal length and altitude, the print can be scaled. It becomes survey-grade proof that survives the swamp's shifting vegetation. Klages flew low over the swamp and triggered the shutter. The resulting images were clear. They showed the Thunderbolt resting in the water, the fuselage intact, and the wings level. Crucially, the photos confirmed the orientation of the nose and the density of the surrounding grass. Because of the filter error on the main mission, these images of a friendly wreck became the only valuable output of the flight. They froze the location of Carter's Lil Pill on a strip of film, proving that the aircraft had not sunk and had not been broken apart by the impact forces. In the years that followed, those photographs became one of the clearest confirmations that the aircraft had gone down intact and remained identifiable. The war moved north. The personnel rotated home. The heavy equipment was scrapped. The logic of the 1940s dictated that a crashed airplane in a swamp was waste metal not worth the risk of retrieval. The coordinates remained in the archives, but the physical path to the site was erased by the growth of the swamp. By 1968, the value equation had changed. The aviation community began to view the Thunderbolt not as scrap, but as a finite historical resource. A recovery team led by Bill Chapman decided to act on the data. They knew the aircraft was there because the camera had verified it. They knew it was largely intact because the images showed the structural unity. However, a photograph cannot convey the viscosity of the mud or the depth of the water. The team had a map, but they did not have a road. To convert the image back into a tangible object, they would have to enter the swamp with heavy equipment. They would soon discover that while the photo showed a complete aircraft, the logistics of extraction would force them to make a decision that would physically sever the integrity of the airframe. The recovery operation launched in 1968 was defined by a harsh engineering paradox. To save the aircraft from total dissolution in the swamp, the team had to inflict significant structural damage upon the airframe. The objective was to extract the P47 from the mud and transport it to a secure facility in Port Moresby. However, the operational constraints of the environment forced a trade-off between historical integrity and physical retrieval. The first barrier was the ground itself. The Waigani Swamp in the dry season presents a deceptive surface. While it may appear solid enough to walk on, the soil-bearing capacity is insufficient to support the static load of a heavy lift crane. A crane requires a stable base to manage the moment arm of a lift. If the outriggers sink into the anaerobic mud, the machinery will topple. This simple geotechnical fact eliminated the possibility of a vertical extraction. The aircraft could not be plucked from its resting place. It had to be dragged. The second barrier was the geometry of the Thunderbolt itself. The aircraft has a wingspan of nearly 41 feet. The only route connecting the swamp edge to the city was a series of narrow, rough tracks cut through the bush. These roads were bordered by dense trees and steep embankments. Transporting the aircraft in one piece would violate the available transport geometry. The wings would strike obstacles on both sides, likely tearing the airframe apart in an uncontrolled manner. Standard aviation maintenance procedure for dismantling an aircraft involves removing the high-strength steel bolts that connect the wing spars to the fuselage. However, the team faced the cumulative effects of corrosion chemistry. When two dissimilar metals, such as steel bolts and aluminum spars, are submerged in an electrolyte like acidic swamp water, they form a galvanic cell. Over 25 years, this reaction creates a bond that is often stronger than the parent metal. The bolts were not just rusted, they were fused to the structure on a molecular level. Attempting to torque them out would shear the heads off, leaving the shafts buried in the spar. Faced with seized bolts and a narrow road, the team leader Bill Chapman made the decision to utilize the concept of destructive recovery. This is a controversial but sometimes necessary approach where the artifact is intentionally modified to make the logistics of rescue possible. Using manual handsaws, the team cut through the wing structures outboard of the main attachment points. They also severed the fuselage to separate the tail section. This was not a precise surgical separation at a factory seam. It was a rough field modification designed to reduce the width and length of the load to fit a flatbed trailer. The physical extraction involved winching the fuselage sections across the mud until they reached the graded track. Once the components were loaded onto the trailer, a new hazard emerged from the environment. The ambient temperature was hovering near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The recovery vehicles and the trailer were moving through tall, dry kunai grass. During the transport phase, the friction of the trailer tires against the vegetation, combined with the heat of the brake drums, created an ignition source. A grass fire broke out on the trailer itself. The flames fed on the dry material trapped in the wheel wells and under the belly of the aircraft. The team had to react immediately to extinguish the blaze. Fire is particularly dangerous to recovered aluminum, as it can alter the heat treatment of the alloy or scorch the surviving paint, destroying the very history they had just cut the plane apart to save. The arrival of the components in Port Moresby marked the end of the in-situ preservation. The protective mud was gone. The aircraft was now a collection of severed parts, saved from the swamp but scarred by the saw and the fire. The decision to cut the airframe had solved the logistical problem of 1968, but it created a massive reconstruction challenge for the future. The wings had not been unbolted, they had been amputated. The question was no longer about recovery, it was about whether the damage inflicted to save the machine could ever be reversed. The life cycle of a recovered aircraft is determined by a single institutional decision: conservation or reconstruction. When the components of Carter's Lil Pill arrived in Port Moresby, they represented a disjointed collection of aluminum sections severed by handsaws and scarred by fire. The choice facing the subsequent owners was whether to display the machine as a recovered wreck, preserving the evidence of its 25 years in the swamp and its brutal extraction, or to attempt to reverse the damage and return the airframe to its 1943 configuration. The path to this decision was not linear. For decades, the airframe remained in a state of limbo. It moved from Papua New Guinea to the Museum of Transport and Technology in New Zealand. During this period, the aircraft was a currency of exchange rather than a priority for restoration. In a transaction that highlights the unique valuation logic of the vintage aviation market, serial number 42-8066 was eventually traded for a replica of a World War I Sopwith Camel. This exchange moved the Thunderbolt from the static storage of the Southern Hemisphere to the active restoration pipeline of the United States. The technical challenge of the restoration was defined by the concept of metal replacement. This is the engineering process of substituting corroded or missing structure with new material while maintaining the identity of the artifact. In the case of Carter's Lil Pill, the damage was twofold. First, the recovery cuts made in 1968 had to be spliced. This required fabricating internal doubler plates to bridge the gaps in the spars where the saws had passed. The goal was to restore the visual continuity of the wings, even if the structural strength required for flight was no longer the objective. The second challenge was the corrosion that had occurred deep within the swamp. While the mud had protected the lower fuselage from rapid oxidation, the tail section had been exposed to the fluctuating waterline. The aluminum skins in this area were pitted and thinned by the acidic environment. To restore the aircraft, the restoration team at the Pima Air and Space Museum faced a hard constraint. They could not simply patch the holes. The geometry of the tail surfaces had to be rebuilt using new aluminum sheet, formed on English wheels and Pullmax machines to match the compound curves of the original Republic factory dies. The consensus is practical. Keep the data plates and the core load-bearing structure, and the serial identity remains continuous. The restoration pivot for Carter's Lil Pill was a decision to prioritize the educational representation of the P-47 over the archaeological evidence of its crash. By choosing to splice the wings and rebuild the tail, the museum elected to erase the scars of the 1968 extraction. The handsaw marks were covered. The fire damage was sanded away. The corrosion was excised. This choice locked the aircraft onto a trajectory of success. It would not remain a rotting hulk in a container. It was destined to stand on its landing gear again, presenting the silhouette of a combat-ready fighter. The pivot transformed the object from a victim of the swamp into a curated exhibit. The physical work required to achieve this was immense, involving thousands of rivets and thousands of man-hours. The result would be a machine that looked ready for a mission, even if its engine was forever silenced by the friction weld of 1943. Serial number 42-8066 is no longer a missing entry in a military archive. It is a tangible, three-dimensional object acquired for the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona, and destined to stand on its landing gear once restoration is complete. To the casual observer, it will appear ready for flight. The aluminum skin will be polished, the national insignia crisp, the canopy glass clear. However, this visual perfection is a carefully constructed illusion. The reality of the airframe is defined by the heavy industrial interventions required to bring it to this state. The restoration process has effectively erased the visible evidence of the swamp. The mud that encased the lower fuselage for 25 years has been chemically neutralized and removed. The corrosion pits that marred the surface have been filled or replaced with new metal. The structural wounds from the 1968 recovery, the saw cuts through the wings and the fuselage, are now hidden beneath the skin, bridged by internal doublers and rows of flush rivets. The presence of this aircraft in a climate-controlled hangar is the final output of the recovery logic. The primary objective was to secure the physical form of the Thunderbolt against the entropy of the environment. In the Waigani Swamp, the airframe was slowly converting into oxide and unrecognizable debris. In Tucson, the rate of decay has been arrested. The arid desert air provides a stable environment that creates a permanent stasis for the metal. Yet there is a distinction between the artifact that landed in the swamp and the exhibit that stands in the museum. The restoration has preserved the shape, but it has altered the fabric. A significant percentage of the material now bolted to the keel is modern replacement alloy. The original fabric control surfaces, long since rotted away by the tropical humidity, are new. The electrical wiring, the hydraulic lines, and the rubber seals are modern reproductions. What remains of the original 1943 machine is the core structure, the heavy steel firewall, the main spars, and the data plates that carry the identity of the aircraft. The legacy of Carter's Lil Pill is not found in the pristine shine of its current condition, but in the unlikely chain of events that allowed it to survive at all. Most aircraft lost in Papua New Guinea were scrapped in place or swallowed entirely by the jungle. This specific airframe exists because of a series of technical anomalies. The engine failure was survivable. The swamp landing was soft enough to prevent breakup. The mud was chemically stable enough to slow corrosion. Most critically, the existence of this exhibit ties back to the procedural error committed by Lieutenant Klages in December 1943. Without his mistake with the camera filter, there would have been no high-contrast photo verification of the site. Without that photo, the recovery team in 1968 might never have invested the capital to cut a road into the swamp. The physical mass of 5 tons of aluminum sitting in Arizona is the direct consequence of a shutter clicked on a reconnaissance flight over 80 years ago. The aircraft is now silent. The engine that seized and forced Lieutenant Harding to glide into the kunai grass has been cleaned and reassembled, but it will never run again. The friction weld that stopped the propeller is part of the internal history of the machine, hidden inside the crankcase. The violence of the impact and the desperate labor of the extraction team with their handsaws are no longer visible. What remains is the geometry of the design. The P-47 was built to be robust, to absorb punishment, and to bring its pilot home. In a different sense, it has fulfilled that design mandate. It took decades longer than expected, and it required being cut apart and rebuilt. But serial number 4-2-8066 eventually completed its journey from the swamp to the sanctuary of the museum. It stands now as a static testament to the engineering of the past and the persistence of those who refused to let history dissolve into the mud.